Okay, so my name is Dawn Mahler, and I'm a clinical psychologist. I work at the Counseling Center here at Cal U, and I'm going to be talking to you about mindfulness and how you can integrate that into doing therapy. So, I want to start off with a poem that I think sums up the spirit of mindfulness. And this is called Life is Always Unfinished Business by Richard Gilbert. And he says, in the midst of the whirling day, in the hectic rush to be doing, in the frantic pace of life, pause here for a moment, catch your breath, relax your body, loosen your grip on life. Consider that our lives are always unfinished business. Imagine that the picture of our being is never complete. Allow your life to be a work in progress. Do not hurry to mold the masterpiece. Do not rush to finish the picture. Do not be impatient to complete the drawing. From beckoning birth to dawning death, we are in process. And always there is more to be done. Do not let the incompleteness weigh on your spirit. Do not despair that imperfection marks your every day. Do not fear that we are still in the making. Let us instead be grateful that the world is still to be created. Let us give thanks that we can be more than we are. Let us celebrate the power of the incomplete, for life is always unfinished business. All right, so we're going to be talking about mindfulness. And I think mindfulness can be integrated into clients' lives and into therapists' lives as well, students' lives, and I think it has a place. So, in the last several years, mindfulness has been a pretty hot topic in the psychotherapy field. But when you've been in the field as long as I have, you become much less inclined to jump on the latest bandwagon. To give you some perspective, by the time I hit graduate school in the mid-1980s, although psychoanalysis was on its way out, its offshoots like psychodynamic therapy and object relations therapy were still really in vogue. At the very same time, in other circles, behavior therapy and cognitive behavior therapy and family systems therapy were fairly well established. And therapists back then tended to have a real me versus them mentality. There was this idea that if what I'm doing works, then what you're doing probably doesn't work. And allegiance to one's theory was paramount, and eclecticism was almost viewed as a dirty word. Now, the fact is today, most therapists will admit that they are eclectic, that they really draw from different theories. But back then, it was not taken kindly. So in addition to these major theories, therapists, are constantly taking some of the established ideas, adding some new techniques or a new spin, and then attaching his or her name to it and marketing it as a new theory. So what I'm saying is, in the last 30 years or so, different therapies have just abounded and new ones are coming out all the time. So that's why, when I first started seeing mindfulness everywhere, I kind of gave a great sigh. But as it turned out, over the last maybe 5 or 6 years, I happened upon some books based on Eastern philosophies and realized that some of the ancient philosophies from the East suggest a very different but compelling way of viewing human nature and the problems of human nature. And I've just found them to be really useful. And I decided to give mindfulness a chance and started reading about mindfulness-based theories of therapy. So mindfulness has its roots in Buddhism, but it's been adapted for the most part without this spiritual element for psychotherapy. In the book, The Mindful Way Through Depression, the authors Williams, Teasdale, Siegel, and Kabat-Zinn defined mindfulness as the awareness that emerges through paying attention on purpose and non-judgmentally to the unfolding of experience moment to moment. So what people are realizing is that there's a healing power to awareness of the present moment. I want to mention that human behavior is complex, so to me it doesn't make sense to really limit oneself to any one theory. You can borrow strategies from many different theories in your work with clients. When somebody is anxious or depressed, for instance, you want to disrupt the negative cycles, and the different theories just suggest different points of entry into this cycle. I'm going to address some of the key elements to mindfulness as they apply to emotional health. All right, so the first key element of mindfulness that I'm going to talk about is the notion that we should accept reality as it is. All right, when we practice mindfulness, we pay precise, non-judgmental attention to our experiences as they arise and subside, rejecting nothing. We don't struggle to get away from experiences that we find difficult. We practice being with them. Marsha Linehan, who founded DBT, dialectical behavior therapy, used mindfulness practices when she encouraged her clients to experience what she called radical acceptance. You can also hear it being called sometimes radical acceptance of what is. And this involves fully embracing, the whole of human experience. So helplessness, terror, losses, and other painful facts of life, just like you embrace the positive. Michael A. Singer wrote a book called The Untethered Soul, which I think is a really great book. It's really one of my favorites. And here's a quote from that. He writes, There is really no reason for tension or problems. Stress only happens when you resist life's events. If you are neither pushing life away nor pulling it towards you, then you are not creating any resistance. You are simply present. In this state, you are just witnessing and experiencing the events of life taking place. If you choose to live this way, you will see that life can be lived in a state of peace. So when we're mindful, we show up for our lives. We don't miss them in being distracted by thoughts or our wishes that things were different. So somebody said to Eckhart Tolle, who wrote The Power of Now, another very great book, but the present moment is sometimes unacceptable, unpleasant, or awful. And what he says to that is, it is as it is. Observe how the mind labels it and how this labeling process, this continuous sitting in judgment, creates pain and unhappiness. By watching the mechanics of the mind, you step out of its resistance patterns, and you can then allow the present moment to be. This will give you a taste of the state of inner freedom from external conditions, the state of true inner peace. Then see what happens and take action if necessary or possible. Accept, then act. Whatever the present moment contains, accept it as if you had chosen it. Always work with it, not against it. Make it your friend and ally, not your enemy. This will miraculously transform your whole life. Okay. The second key element of mindfulness that I'll address is that we shouldn't put too much stock in thinking. It's not that you don't think, it's just that you don't believe everything that you think. Okay. In The Mindful Way Through Depression, the authors point out that our reactions to feeling unhappy can transform what might otherwise be just a brief passing sadness into persistent and recurrent depression. Feeling sad, they say, is not the problem. That's a natural mind state. It's when we dwell on how to get rid of our feelings of sadness that our whole experience is one of contraction. So the mind closes in on itself. And, they're talking about resistance. So the idea is never resist, never close. They say that there's a critical moment where we could actually shift things away from the downward spiral. When people start, you realize that you're getting depressed. And And the problem is that we try to think our way out of moods by working out what's wrong. So, like, what's wrong with me? Why do I always feel so overwhelmed? But this critical thinking, which often turns into rumination or dwelling, may be the wrong tool for the job. They suggest an alternative, which is awareness. So, awareness is kind of different than trying to think our way out of a bad mood. For instance, instead of thinking about things, we can experience them through our senses. We can see our thoughts as mental events that come and go instead of taking them literally. We can start living right here in the present moment instead of dwelling on the past or worrying about the future. Awareness can also help us to stop trying to force life to be a certain way because we're uncomfortable right now. We'll be able to see that wanting things to be different from the way they are right now is where rumination begins. Instead, we become aware of how things are right now. So mindfulness is not passive resignation. It's a stance by which we intentionally welcome and turn toward whatever arises, including inner experiences that we'd normally try to escape. So how can we apply this to our lives? Well, let's say that you wake up in the morning and you're feeling depressed. The authors are saying that there's a critical moment where you can make things much worse by asking yourself, why am I depressed? And then believing what the mind supplies you. The problem is that in a depressed state of mind, you will remember lots of events that your mind associates with this state of mind. Your mind will say, I'm depressed because my friends insulted me. Everyone always insults me. There's something wrong with me. I'm embarrassed to even be around people, etc. Or it might say, I'm depressed because I ate too much last night. I always eat too much and I sleep too much. My life is out of control. But there's another way to handle this. We can stop identifying with our depressive thoughts. And you do this by cultivating awareness of the present. So, again, back to Williams, Teasdale, Siegel, and Kabat-Zinn, who wrote The Mindful Way Through Depression. They say, this is a quote, we begin to see thoughts as secretions of the mind arising and passing like clouds moving across a vast sky. We stop believing in them as we once did. That, in turn, lessens their grip and reduces our emotional reactivity to them. This is a significant departure from traditional CBT, which is cognitive behavior therapy, which encourages clients to notice thoughts and properly label them, but then try to replace irrational maladaptive thoughts with more adaptive ones. Instead of trying to control experience, it helps us to learn how to be with experience and accept it. Acceptance modulates our stress response. Our system is quite good at returning to baseline when it isn't re-aroused by thoughts of impending disaster. So I'm going to repeat that part of the quote. Our system is quite good at returning to baseline when it isn't re-aroused by thoughts of impending disaster. So, like CBT, it says that a lot of times it's our thoughts that get in the way. Okay, so Eckhart Tolle, in The Power of Now, puts it this way. This is a quote. Focus attention on the feeling inside you, accept that it is there. Don't think about it. Don't let the feeling turn into thinking. Don't judge or analyze. Don't make an identity for yourself out of it. Stay present and continue to be the observer of what is happening inside you. Become aware not only of the emotional pain, but also of the one who observes, the silent watcher. This is the power of now, the power of your own conscious presence. Then see what happens, end quote. So in other words, the idea is to notice what you feel inside rather than be taken over by it. So I want to add something here. It's not that we should stop thinking altogether. It's more that it seems that we've evolved to be thinking animals because we had to rely on our intellect to survive. Thinking has kind of over-evolved, so we spend a little time simply being in the being mode. Okay, again, we kind of tend to stay in the thinking mode. And in fact, it seems that we evolved not to be just thinking animals, but thinking bad thoughts animals. Because those ancient ancestors of ours who remembered, you don't want to get too close to a lion or a cliff, those were the ones who survived. As Ronald Siegel put it in an article called West Meets East, he says, we evolved minds that are like Velcro for bad thoughts and Teflon for good ones. So we just need to understand our thinking minds. We need to remind ourselves to stop thinking when the thinking becomes detrimental, and either to switch into mindfulness or at least, as CBT would say, to replace our irrational thoughts with more rational ones. And this is especially true for people who tend to be obsessive. And I would say people who tend toward anxiety and depression often are those same people who tend to be obsessive. All right, so the third tenet of mindfulness that I'll discuss. This idea is that we must develop present moment awareness instead of getting caught up in thoughts and feelings. And I realize that there is some overlap between these tenets. Okay, now I'm not exactly sure how this person says his name, but it's something like Thich Nhat Hanh. He wrote The Sun, My Heart. And he says, this is a quote, "Peace can only exist in the present moment. It's ridiculous to say, wait until I finish this. Then I will be free to live in peace. What is this? A diploma, a job, a house, the payment of a debt. If you think that way, peace will never come. There's always another this that will follow the present one. If you're not living in peace at this moment, you will never be able to. If you truly want to be at peace, you must be at peace right now. Otherwise, there is only the hope of peace someday." Okay, so I'm going to suggest a mindfulness exercise, and I'm not going to have you go through it, but I'm just going to kind of give you the instructions to go through it on your own time. And this is from a Psychology Today article called The Courage to be Present. And the idea is that we can choose what to attend to. So if we find ourselves getting all caught up in thoughts, we can bring our mind back to the present moment. And for this exercise, you will take a posture that's upright but not rigid. And you'll let your hands rest on your thighs. Your eyes are somewhat open, and you'll gaze gently on the floor in front of you, about 4 to 6 feet away. And you'll bring your attention to your body and the environment. And then if your attention wanders away, you just gently bring it back to your body and the environment. And you're just going to stay like that for a few minutes, paying attention to your body and the environment around you. And then you'll rest your attention lightly on the breath. You'll feel it as it comes into your body and as it leaves your body. And there's no special way to breathe in this technique. And you'll continue to lightly focus on the breath while maintaining an awareness of your body and the environment around you. And when you find yourself so caught up in thoughts that you forget that you're even sitting in the room, that's when you'll gently bring yourself back to the breath. And you'll sit like that for a little while, and then that'll be the end of the exercise. But again, it's helpful to do this sort of thing, even just throughout the day, to retrain yourself to get some discipline over the mind. It gets all caught up in these negative thoughts, you bring it back to the breath, or you bring it back to the environment. Okay. Eckhart Tolle has a nice statement about staying present in the present moment. And he says, quote, "Are you worried? Do you have many what-if thoughts? You are identified with your mind, which is projecting itself into an imaginary future situation and creating fear. There's no way you can cope with such a situation because it doesn't exist. It's a mental phantom. You can stop this health and life-corroding insanity simply by acknowledging the present moment. Become aware of your breathing. Feel the air flowing in and out of your body. Feel your inner energy field. All you ever have to cope with in real life, as opposed to your imaginary mind projections, is this moment. Ask yourself what problem you have right now, not next year, tomorrow, or 5 minutes from now. What's wrong with this moment? You can always cope with the now, but you can never cope with the future, nor do you have to. The answer, the strength, the right action, or the resource will be there when you need it, not before or not after." And that's on page 85 of The Power of Now. Okay, the fourth and last element of mindfulness that I'm going to go over with you is the idea that we should never close. In the prelude of the book by Elizabeth Lesser called Broken Open, she talks about coming across a quote that was under a painting of a rose. She saw this in a shop when she was traveling. And it said, quote, "And the time came when the risk to remain tight in a bud was more painful than the risk it took to blossom," end quote. And she goes on to say, quote, "How strange that the nature of life has changed, yet the nature of human beings is to resist change. And how ironic that the difficult times we fear might ruin us are the very ones that can break us open and help us blossom into who we were meant to be," end quote. Michael Singer says it this way in The Untethered Soul. And there's 2 quotes here. He says, "You will get to a point in your growth where you understand that if you protect yourself, you'll never be free. It's that simple. Because you're scared, you have locked yourself within your house and pulled down all the shades. Now it's dark and you want to feel the sunlight, but you can't. It's impossible. If you close and protect yourself, you are locking this scared, insecure person within your heart. You will never be free that way. Living like this allows for very little spontaneous joy, enthusiasm, and excitement for life. Most people just go from day to day protecting themselves and making sure nothing goes wrong. At the end of the day, when someone asks, 'How was your day?' a normal response is, 'Not too bad,' or 'I'll survive.' What is that telling you about their view of life? They see life as a threat. A good day means you made it through without getting hurt. The longer you live like that, the more closed you become." All right, so what can be done instead? And he says, you must let your entire psyche surface. Every little separated piece of it must be permitted to pass through. Right now, many fragmented parts of your psyche are held within you. If you want to be free, it all has to be equally exposed to your awareness and released. But it will never get exposed if you are closing yourself. So you catch on that no matter how much pain the exposure creates. You are willing to pay the price for freedom. So he's saying open to your emotions, let them come through. Now I'll say typically the idea is that you let them into your consciousness with the idea that you'll release them. It's not that you're going to let them in and you're going to dwell and dwell and dwell. It's that you're going to be releasing them. And I will say this is very much like our first tenet, which is accept reality as it is. I'm just going to go over some references here. Again, I was using The Mindful Way Through Depression, The Untethered Soul, West Meets East, Broken Open, The Power of Now, and that exercise came from an article, The Courage to Be Present. Okay, so I want to say that I would strongly recommend two books. The first is The Untethered Soul by Michael A. Singer. To me, it's just really profound. It's a book that you really have to read bit by bit because you have to absorb it. And then another is Eckhart Tolle's The Power of Now, which I think is a little more accessible in terms of, you can kind of read that straight through, but it's equally profound, I think. What I want to talk to you about now is how to use mindfulness with clients. And one thing I'll say is that I found that typically these concepts are more easily used with graduate students and older students, the non-traditional students that we have, than the undergrads. Because I don't know if it's a level of development or what, but I've seen that people can kind of grasp the ideas and they seem to think that it applies, more to them. So the older the better. I don't know that I could really use. Maybe some people have adapted mindfulness with younger people, but I think it is easier with older people. The other thing is that as helpful as mindfulness is, like I said earlier, most people do tend to be eclectic. I find that it's helpful when it's incorporated with other methods. It's really just my opinion. If somebody comes in and they're really in a lot of distress, I think it helps to use the technique of opening to thoughts and feelings rather than, closing them down and just talking about coping techniques. But then to add a cognitive behavioral component that works with the thoughts, along with some exploration that hopefully allows for some insight. I think people do feel like when they have a grasp on why they're feeling like they do, I think that they feel better about it. So what I'm going to do is talk to you about one roadmap for getting people through an episode of really high negative emotion like depression or anxiety. And by the way, this general structure can be found on a link on the CalU website. It's the Counseling Center page on the CalU website. There's a link in red if you wanted to take a look at that. But I do think that it helps people to feel at least somewhat better fairly quickly. So, I tell people that they can approach this event like a scientist, that they're going to be recording their data. And as they go through this, I want them to notice any little thing, an idea, a behavior, whatever it is, that makes them feel better. And then as they go through this, it's like a worksheet. As they go through, they're going to star or put something in the margin noting what makes them feel better, because that is really good information to have at the ready. People who have depression, it tends to be a recurrent sort of thing, anxiety as well, and if they know what worked last time and they have it, they can grab it and it can be in front of them, they're going to feel better next time. So I'll have them first on a scale of 0 to 10, rate how upset they are, with 10 being the highest. And then I encourage them to consider that even though their emotional brain might not be able to accept this fact, I want them to remind themselves of this, which is they're not always going to feel like this. And to me, that's the most important thing that somebody can say to somebody else in distress. They're not always going to feel like this, because it feels so miserable to be in a high state of negative emotion. And that's really scary to think they're not going to be able to get out of it. And it's just true. We don't stay in one spot. And I tell people that the thoughts and images that are going through their mind right now will not bother them as much later. The brain on high negative emotion is like a brain having a bad drug trip. So it's spewing out all these distorted, irrational thoughts. And the problem is that the brain in this emotional state is likely to believe that this is reality, even when it isn't. So you just, even if you're not going to take it 100% to heart, just reminding yourself, yes, I'll get through this, and I'm not always going to feel this way is really important. Okay. And I like to remind people that they're not alone in their misery. So these dark nights of the soul have been written about, people go through them. It's part of this human journey. There's nothing wrong with people for having them. When people get depressed and anxious, one thing that makes things worse, but it's so common, is they'll think, I shouldn't feel this way. I'm weak to feel this way. I've always felt this way. Nobody else ever feels this way. These things aren't true, and they just make people feel worse. I tell them that the first step to healing is to go right into the pain or fear. This is definitely a mindfulness idea. Don't close. Let's go through it. It's really helpful in therapy to have somebody, there just being with you as you go through it. But I have them just go through it. They'll relax their body. They'll invite the awful thoughts and feelings. And then I have them write down where they feel these feelings in the body. So it could be, in the throat, that can be tight. Sometimes people get stomach aches. They'll feel tightness, in their shoulders. Their chest can feel tight. So I want them to just take note. And then they'll write down all these painful thoughts and images that are going through their heads. And I tell them, because believe it or not, very soon they may not even be able to remember the details of their episodes. We see this all the time. Somebody comes in and they can tell me, well, on Saturday it was really, really bad. But they don't remember the specifics because they're out of that mindset. And it's just hard to remember, but I want them to remember here because I want to address these thoughts and feelings. So I have them write them down and then number them, and that comes up later. And then I have them go through it on a scale of 0 or 1 to 10, how distressed they are. Now, it may not have changed any. It may be worse for all we know, but again, they're being a scientist. I'm trying to encourage them to be that observer. Again, a mindfulness thought. You're the observer. This isn't necessarily reality, or, feelings aren't thoughts. It's not a reflection of reality necessarily. It's just how they feel. So let's observe it. And then what I'm trying to do is to help them to switch course so they can start employing their rational mind again. This is a bit of a deviation from just strict mindfulness. Typically, people are just so upset and they need to address those thoughts, or at least that's how I see it. They want to address those thoughts, and so, but they can't really do it very well in that highly emotional mindset. And so I just have them start thinking about things rationally. So I say, if there's guilt or regret or shame to their problem, consider if they, feel they did something wrong, what are the underlying reasons that they did it? So it probably didn't come out of nowhere. Your mind is trying to tell you, I'm just a bad person, I'm just a weak person. Well, there's probably something else behind it. So let's think about it. People act for multiple reasons, not just one reason. What's behind it? Is it something from the past? And if you stumble upon a blind spot, that's natural. We all have strengths and weaknesses for sure. And, it's better for us to admit our imperfections. We'll be a better person for having discovered them. So we try to be honest with ourselves. But then we also want to say, okay, so as important as it is that we own up to our responsibility and what happens, if we are indeed responsible to some degree, is it completely our fault? Is there any chance that somebody else is partly responsible, even if he or she won't admit it? And if so, then you're gonna, it's a worksheet. You'll explain what that's all about. If there's a fear or anxiety component to the problem, specifically, what are you afraid will happen? And I think that's actually a really good thing to ask a lot of clients, whether they're depressed or anxious or whatever. What are you afraid of? And get really specific with it. Okay, and then how likely is it that they think that this really will happen? Because sometimes it's really the negative emotion. You think about fear of flying. People are really nervous about flying, but they'll admit it's very unlikely that they're going to get into a crash the next time that they fly. Then I'll have people take a couple of deep breaths, slow down their breathing for a couple minutes. When you relax your body, you tend to relax your mind. I'll have them pay attention to their slow, deep breaths. Notice what's happening in their mind and body and record it. There's a couple reasons for this. I think the main one is to not distract themselves, but to stop that cycle of thinking. So I guess it is a distraction, but it's a distraction from the thinking. Give your mind a break and to show yourself that you do have some control over your thoughts. Our thoughts, left on their own, will go down to the negative very often, especially if you're depressed or anxious, but you have some control over that. I'll have people consider, is there a loss component to their problem? And if so, is their mind idealizing what they had, making it seem like it was perfect when it wasn't? This is really typical when people are mourning a loss of any kind. People hate loss. They're really loss averse, and this has been shown. But it's really tough when people feel like, this person was just perfect for me. And, I want to honor that to some extent, but if you feel like you've just lost something or someone that's absolutely perfect, it's really going to hurt a lot. But if you realize, there are other paths, or maybe it wasn't as perfect as I thought, that's a little bit more manageable. We can handle that a little bit better. If people are feeling hopeless about the future, I tell them as long as you're breathing, there is hope. No matter what you've done, what others have done, what you've lost, if you just hang in there, you will come out the other side. And then I ask people to consider if they're feeling this badly due to some imbalance in their life. So what we do to take care of our bodies helps to take care of our mind. And this has been shown, again and again in various studies. So if you didn't get a good night's sleep, a lot of times, of course, people can't sleep when they're depressed. If they're just working themselves into the ground, because we're not robots, if they don't have enough people to talk to, if they're hungry, if they're abusing substances, if they're not eating right, these things can be fixed if they attend to them. So I have people, just write down what's out of balance in their life. Again, that helps them to see that there's a lot at play here. It's not just the situation. It's not hopeless. They can start to get back to normal. And then I ask people to consider that sometimes we don't really know what will turn out to be good fortune and what will turn out to be bad fortune. Sometimes things have a silver lining, and sometimes it is just that we learn something about ourselves when we go through something bad, or that we develop empathy for other people, which is really important. And I'll say that's really important as a therapist, to have some empathy for these human things that we go through. Poet Mary Oliver wrote this quote. This is from Thirst, 2007. She wrote, "Someone I loved once gave me a box full of darkness. It took me years to understand that this too was a gift." So, okay. And then I ask people to think of ways that they can at least make the best of their current situation, understanding that things may improve in the future. So this is our starting point. Again, that radical acceptance of what is, but it's not necessarily that it's going to stay like that. But what can they do to make the best of a bad situation? So, as we've talked about, often we can find some solace when we remember to attend to the present moment. So I talk to them about ways to do that. And then I have them consider, do they have a religious or philosophical viewpoint that could help them right now? For instance, people will say, I believe that things happen for a reason. I believe that I'm here for, some purpose. I believe that everything will be all right in the end. That sort of thing. Because now is the time to remember these things. And some people might decide, okay, maybe I want to go back to church, or I want to talk to a preacher or a priest or something like that. So that can be helpful. And then I have people take another deep breath and relax their body, relax their shoulders and their throat. And then, importantly, this is something that I think is probably one of the most helpful things they can do. So the next step is to go back to what they wrote, those thoughts that were bothering them, those feelings that were bothering them. They're numbered, and I have them see if they can, think differently about them in any way now. So I have them reconsider them. Are there any positive ideas? And then I have them write down those statements. So things may not completely change. They may be, really upset that their grandmother died or their grandfather died, or somebody is sick, or they had a breakup, or they failed a class, or whatever it is. I mean, it's still bothering them, but maybe there's some way that, they're realizing that that they can, think differently about it and more hopefully about it. So at that point, I have them reassess where they are right now. I would bet at this point that on a scale of 1 to 10, they're not going to be quite as upset. And then I tell them some, a few things that they need to do. For the rest of that day, they need to take extreme care of themselves, because they are not out of the woods. One thing that we see is people go through these episodes and then there's a little bit of lifting and they think, oh my God, I'm good. I'm good. Thank God I'm through that. Whew. And then they think that they're just going to be fine. And a lot of times, there is this getting better, which is nice, but there's some dips. And so we point that out to them that, just because maybe some of those feelings come back, it doesn't mean they're at square one again. But they do need to take care of themselves. Now's not the time to make a big decision, maybe, or to really crack down on oneself in some way. Like give yourself some time to heal from this. I tell people that, okay, they've opened up to all of this, and yes, I believe in being open, but at some point, you may need to take a break from these thoughts and feelings, and you can say to yourself, let it go. Let it go. You might come back to it, in a few hours even, but let it go for a while. I have people think about things that they like to do, and then pick something to do. So it could be baking brownies, it could be coloring, which is now kind of a fad, and clients will tell me that they find that really helpful. There are these pages that you can download and print out, and you use like colored pencils, these intricate little, I think they're called mandalas or something, these Hindu drawings, but it can be anything. It could be a kid's coloring book, but it doesn't have to be that. They can, if there's a show like a comedy, like Modern Family or something that's light, that they could watch. Probably not something like just laying in bed, but sitting up or going out, definitely taking a walk, and then something that's meditative, like hearing your paying attention to your footsteps, looking around, listening, so kind of getting in touch with your senses, noticing your breathing. And then, when they're done with that, doing some kind of task, something little, because productivity is great for depression and anxiety, so getting something done. It can be the smallest thing. Like, maybe they're saying, my whole apartment's a mess, but I'm going to unload the dishwasher. That can be helpful. And then they can go back and forth like that for a while. So the idea is to give people this roadmap, something they can handle. They're getting something done. They're taking care of themselves. They're not turning on themselves, which is so common with depression. Like I said, they'll get into this, I should never feel this way. There's something wrong with me. No, this is a way of a different way of being with yourself, which is, I'm going to nurture myself through this. This has been hellish, and I'm going to take care of myself. That's a much better way of getting through. I also like people to think about what they're grateful for or happy about in their lives and write it down. I like them to have that at the ready. I think having, people have, making a little kit for how to get through an episode is good. And if they have things written down that they're happy about and proud about, that's really good. They may not think about this, when they're in a negative mind state. And then, what are your strengths? Is there anything you're looking forward to in the future? If there's not, can you plan something? Is there a little break, a little vacation? What about going home and seeing parents or best friend or something? So that they can see that, the future can have some positive. And then I have them rate their distress again. I tell people that there are things they should avoid right then, like overwork, too much caffeine, maybe even too much exercise. Just like really overdoing it is maybe not such a great idea. And again, I mentioned this, but not making any major decisions right away. People will get all upset and they'll go in and say, I quit, into their jobs, or they'll break up with somebody or something. You can't always undo that. So, it's important to be mindful of that. And then just continued self-care. When people have like a true episode of clinical depression, it can open the gateway for more depression if they're not careful. And so, when people wake up, every day they might be, before their mind starts going, they might want to say, what am I happy about? Oh, I'm going to have a cup of tea, or, I'm really glad that I have, a job, or that I'm passing my classes, or whatever it is. Even the little things. And then I tell people that, help is available. For CalU students, there's free counseling in the Counseling Center, which is in Carter Hall. In the summertime, we're not here all the time. People can use public safety, which is 724-938-4299, to direct them to emergency services. But anyway, so that's how we handle things in the Counseling Center. I mean, everybody, every therapist has their own way. This is kind of one way that I work with students. And again, I think that mindfulness has been really helpful to me personally, but also I think that it's helpful to clients. So I would definitely say, if this rings true to you in any way, read some of those books and see what you think. All right, thanks for listening. Bye-bye.